Welcome. I am Mr. Clock, the creator of the Arma 3 Object Builder add-on for Blender. In this video, I would like to talk about some of the nuances related to shading when setting up a P3D model. When we are creating highly detailed models, mainly with a low poly, high poly workflow and properly baked normal maps and other material maps, it is important to have a consistent shading across all working versions of our models, and especially with the model that finally gets put into game. Unfortunately, there are some issues with this when we are talking about export from Blender to Object Builder. So I created a simple model which is a cube having a single chamfer on one of the edges, and with the three faces having set to smooth shading, and the rest is flat shading, as they are not really important in this case. So I will use basically this edge here to show the issues and the differences between the two programs. So if we jump over to Blender, I set a shiny material so that we can see how the normals and shading changes on the model as we move around. And so what drives the shadings are so-called vertex normals. And if you go into edit mode, we can actually visualize them in Blender with the normals options. In this case, I enabled the split normals since I do have sharp edges, well, edges marked as sharp in Blender. And if we look at the vertex normals, we can see that where vertices only have sharp faces, they have as many normal vectors as the faces that they are part of. In this case, for example, we have 3 vertex normals, each of them perfectly perpendicular to the face they belong to. But where we have edges that are smooth shaded, the vertex normals are in some way averaged between the two faces, and that's what gets us the nicely curved looking shading along smooth shaded edges. Now the issue with this is that there is no real standard method to calculating this vertex normal. One solution could be to simply average the face normal of the two adjacent faces, or we could weight the average in some fashion. For example, weight by the face area, weight by the angle of the two faces. And this is exactly where the difference is between the two programs. So to actually see what happens, let's go back to Object Builder and select our object and open up the vertex properties, which can be done with the Shift-E keybind. If you look at the vertex properties, there is this final section down here which says normals, weighted average by. And this is what sets how Object Builder calculates the normals of the object when it recalculates after some operation. So Object Builder has basically 3 options: by dimension of the face, by impedance angle, so this is the meeting angle of two adjacent faces, and then also fixed, and currently this model is on fixed, and I will explain later why. If we open a new model in Object Builder, we can see that Object Builder actually has the by face dimension option by default. And unfortunately, this is different from what Blender uses. Blender uses the impedance angle, or the corner angle method, as Blender calls it. So this means that the shading of what we see in Blender and what we get in Object Builder might be potentially different based on the method. Now, Blender continuously recalculates the vertex normals, while Object Builder only recalculates in some cases. For example, if we edit the geometry and everything. But if the recalculation happens after the export, the normals will be different, and this will be a problem if you try to apply a baked, highly detailed normal map to the object, because likely what will happen is we export this model from Blender with this shading to FBX, we bake the normal maps in whatever program we choose, and then we export this to P3D, the normals potentially get recalculated, and then when we put the object in game apply the normal map, it will look off. Some of the detail will be squished, the face will look dented in some cases. Really depends on the geometry and the magnitude of distortion. So we need a way to fix this issue. Now the Arma Toolbox add-on by Alvaren got around this issue by not exporting vertex normals to the P3D at all. What it did was that it exported a P3D without any vertex normals. They were all exported as 0, and then it called the utility function of the object builder application to immediately recalculate the vertex normals. Now, what this ended up causing is that the normals were definitely wrong between the two applications and caused some disconnects within game assets, my assets as well, which I did not understand for a long time. The new approach that the Arma 3 Object Builder add-on uses is to export the normals but set them to fixed. As you can see, if we open this box here, which I exported from Blender previously, and as I've shown, if we open up the vertex options, it says fixed locked normals. So what this means is that the plugin exports the object from Blender as we see it in Blender with the normals we see in Blender. It exports it to P3D, and then it sets the vertex flags to locked normals, which means that Object Builder, whatever we do, will not recalculate the normals, which means that the shading will remain consistent. Now the catch here is that if we do any editing in Object Builder, for example, if we rotate the object, the normals won't get recalculated either and will result in broken normals. So be mindful that if you let it export with fixed normals, then you need to do all your transformations in Blender. Don't do them in Object Builder. But this is an effective way to prevent this disparity between the programs. Now, to actually show what the magnitude of this difference is, we can easily do this in Blender. If we duplicate this object, move it over one unit, move it over 1 unit, and if we apply a weighted normal modifier to it with a keep sharp option enabled, and if we set this to face area as default with a weight of 50, we can see how it would look in Object Builder on the right and how it looks by default in Blender. Now this difference might not seem significant, but trust me, it is noticeable with proper normal maps and everything. So it's best to avoid this issue. Now let's look at the vertex flags. So how does the add-on know that it needs to set this option here, and how can you prevent it if you still want to export with a traditional way? Well, the first thing is that by default LOD objects have this flag groups tab below the LOD properties, vertex flags and face flags, and by default these are empty for a very good reason. Usually we don't need to tinker about with these options. So what the add-on does is it looks at the add-on preferences in the default menu, and there are actually two values here for vertex flag and face flag, and we can see that the value is not 000 for the vertex flag. If we click on edit, we can see that the normals are by default set to fixed. If you want the add-on to not set the normals to fixed during export by default, you can set this back to face dimension, and that will just simply set this to 000, and that's what Object Builder would do by default. But let's say that we want to keep it fixed by default, but we just want to overwrite it on this single mesh. If you don't want to change the defaults in the add-on preferences, the other option we have is to create actual flag groups here in these lists for the specific LOD object. So the way to do this is to simply create a flag group. We can give it a new name, so let's say that it's a normal change, or let's say averaged average normals. And we can change this to face dimension as the default. And let's assign the vertices to this group. And now if we export this model back to P3D format, open it, and check on the vertex properties, we can see that now the setting is set to by dimension of face. And if we switch to shaded model view and press F5, we can actually see that during recalculation, after recalculation, the shading changed a bit as we expected. So this is how we can change the normal flags. You can change all the other flags as well, and there is a similar flag group list for face flags, but most of the time these are not needed. The only really potentially useful option right now is the normals one, but I would highly recommend that you leave this to fixed. That way you won't by accident let Object Builder recalculate your normals and screw up the shading between your working model versions.